What happens when the military's most elite sniper loses the one thing everyone believes she needs most? When Lieutenant Sarah Chun volunteered for the experimental blindfolded combat exercise, her fellow Navy SEALs thought she was crazy. After all, how could anyone hit targets they couldn't see? But what they witnessed that day would shatter everything they thought they knew about warfare, human capability, and the true meaning of precision under pressure. This is the extraordinary true story of a woman who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you can see. It's what you can feel, hear, and trust. In a world where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death, Sarah Chun was about to demonstrate that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limits, can achieve the impossible. What started as a routine training exercise would become a legendary moment that would be whispered about in military circles for years to come. Because sometimes, when everything is taken away from you, you discover strength. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Coronado Beach training facility as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her gear for what she thought would be another routine sniper exercise. At 28 years old, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most accurate marksmen in the Navy SEALs, a distinction that came with both respect and skepticism from her male counterparts. Her record spoke for itself: 347 confirmed hits in combat situations, with a precision rate that bordered on supernatural. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Montana, where her father, a retired Marine, had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle steady. Those early mornings in the wilderness, tracking deer and learning to read wind patterns, had shaped her into the soldier she was today. But nothing in her background had prepared her for the conversation she was about to have with Commander James Rodriguez. Commander Rodriguez was a legend in his own right, a man who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and had been instrumental in developing some of the most innovative training programs the SEALs had ever seen. When he approached Sarah that morning, his weathered face carried an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of curiosity and concern that made her stomach tighten with anticipation. "Chun, I need to talk to you about something unusual," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent making life-or-death decisions. "We've been selected to participate in an experimental training program. It's voluntary, and I want to make that clear from the start. What I'm about to propose might sound crazy, but the Pentagon believes it could revolutionize how we approach combat situations." Sarah listened intently as Rodriguez explained the concept. Military researchers had been studying cases where soldiers had performed extraordinary feats when their primary senses were compromised. There were documented instances of blind veterans who could navigate familiar terrain with remarkable precision, and soldiers who had continued to fight effectively even after losing their sight temporarily due to explosions or injuries. The experiment was designed to test whether elite snipers could maintain their effectiveness when deprived of their most crucial sense: sight. The theory was that highly trained marksmen had developed such an intimate understanding of their weapons and environment that they might be able to compensate for the loss of vision through enhanced hearing, spatial awareness, and muscle memory. "They want to blindfold you during a live-fire exercise," Rodriguez said, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "You would be engaging targets at various distances, some static, some moving. There would be spotters giving you information, but the actual aim and trigger control would be entirely up to your other senses." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, not from fear, but from the kind of excitement she had always felt when faced with a seemingly impossible challenge. Throughout her military career, she had consistently volunteered for the most difficult assignments, driven by a need to prove that she belonged among the elite warriors who had initially questioned her presence in their ranks. "What kind of targets are we talking about?" she asked, her mind already working through the logistics of such an exercise. "Standard paper targets at 100, 300, and 500 yards, Rodriguez replied. "But also some ballistic gel dummies at closer range to simulate real combat scenarios." The exercise would be conducted over 3 days, with increasing difficulty each day. On the final day, you'd be engaging multiple targets in a simulated urban environment while blindfolded. The other members of Sarah's unit had gathered around during the conversation, and their reactions ranged from incredulous laughter to genuine concern for her safety. Sergeant Mike Torres, her usual spotter, shook his head in disbelief. "Sarah, this is insane," Torres said. "I've been working with you for 2 years, and, yeah, you're good, better than good. But shooting blind? That's not about skill anymore. That's about luck. And, in this job, we can't afford to rely on luck." Torres had a point, and Sarah knew it. In combat, there was no room for experiments or proving points. Lives depended on precision and reliability. But this wasn't combat. This was training designed to push the boundaries of what was possible. If the exercise could help develop new techniques that might save lives in real situations, wasn't it worth the risk? Chief Petty Officer David Kim, the unit's senior enlisted advisor, offered a different perspective. Kim was known for his analytical approach to everything, and Sarah could see him working through the problem as if it were a complex equation. "Actually, there might be something to this," Kim said thoughtfully. "I've seen Sarah shoot in conditions where visibility was almost zero: sandstorms, heavy rain, dense fog. She always seemed to have an intuitive sense of where her targets were. Maybe that's something that could be developed further." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with various team members sharing stories of situations where they had to rely on senses other than sight. There was the time in Iraq when Torres had guided a wounded soldier to safety through a smoke-filled building using only sound and touch. There was Kim's experience in Afghanistan, where he had detected an enemy ambush by noticing subtle changes in the way sounds echoed off nearby buildings. As Sarah listened to these stories, she began to realize that the proposed experiment wasn't entirely without precedent. In many ways, Special Operations Forces already relied heavily on non-visual cues. The ability to move silently through darkness, to detect threats by sound, to navigate by feel. These were all skills that elite soldiers developed through years of training and experience. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this challenge was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been waiting for. Throughout her career, Sarah had been driven by a desire to push beyond conventional limits, to explore the full potential of human capability under extreme stress. This experiment represented a chance to do exactly that. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady and determined. "When do we start?" Rodriguez smiled, though she could see the concern still lingering in his eyes. "Tomorrow morning. We'll start with basic orientation, learning to handle your weapon while blindfolded, getting used to taking direction from spotters. The actual live-fire exercises won't begin until you're comfortable with the basic movements." That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, her service rifle disassembled on the small table in front of her. She had performed this routine maintenance countless times, but tonight she did it with her eyes closed, focusing on the feel of each component, the weight and texture of every part. The rifle was a customized M40A6, a weapon she had used for over 3 years. She knew its quirks and characteristics better than she knew most people. As she worked in darkness, Sarah began to notice details she had never paid attention to before. The slight vibration in the bolt when it seated properly. The almost inaudible click when the trigger mechanism was correctly aligned. The way the barrel cooled at different rates depending on the ambient temperature. These were subtle cues that she had been unconsciously processing for years, but had never needed to rely on completely. She thought about her childhood in Montana, remembering how her father had taught her to track animals not just by sight, but by reading the forest in all its complexity. The way different types of soil sounded when stepped on. The patterns of disturbed vegetation that indicated the passage of large animals. The subtle changes in bird behavior that warned of predators in the area. "Trust your instincts," her father had always said. "Your eyes can lie to you, especially in poor light or when you're tired. But your other senses, when properly trained, will never let you down." At the time, Sarah had thought he was being overly dramatic. Now, facing the prospect of shooting completely blind, his words took on new meaning. Maybe this wasn't about overcoming a disability or compensating for a missing sense. Maybe it was about unlocking capabilities that had always been there, waiting to be fully developed. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with a steady wind blowing in from the Pacific. Sarah arrived at the range early, finding Rodriguez and a team of researchers already setting up equipment. Dr. Lisa Park, a neuroscientist from Johns Hopkins who was leading the study, approached Sarah with a warm smile and a clipboard full of forms. "Lieutenant Chun, thank you for volunteering for this," Dr. Park said as they walked toward the firing line. "I want you to know that we've taken every possible safety precaution. You'll have 3 spotters, all experienced snipers themselves, and we'll start with very simple exercises before moving to anything challenging." Dr. Park explained that the research was part of a larger SD. The second day dawned with unusual clarity, the kind of crisp morning that made every sound carry farther and every breath feel sharp in the lungs. Sarah arrived at the range to find that the research team had expanded significantly overnight. Word about the experiment had apparently spread through the command structure, and several senior officers were present to observe what many considered either groundbreaking research or elaborate foolishness. Dr. Park approached Sarah with what had become their routine morning briefing. "Today we're increasing the distances and adding complexity," she explained, consulting her notes. "You'll be engaging targets at 300 and 500 yards, and we're introducing moving targets for the first time. The spotters will give you initial orientation, but you'll need to track movement independently." Sarah nodded, though she could feel her stomach tightening with nervous energy. The previous day had been challenging enough with stationary targets at close range. Tracking moving targets while blindfolded would require an entirely different level of skill and intuition. She thought about the countless hours she had spent on similar exercises with her sight intact, remembering how much practice it had taken to master leading targets and calculating trajectory adjustments. Sergeant Torres had spent the evening working on their communication protocols, and he seemed more confident than he had the previous day. "I think I figured out a better way to give you direction," he said as they walked to the firing line. "Instead of compass directions, I'm going to use clock positions relative to your rifle's orientation. And instead of estimated distances, I'm going to give you the time delay between the muzzle flash and the sound of impact." This approach made immediate sense to Sarah. As a trained sniper, she was already intimately familiar with the relationship between distance and the delay between firing and impact. Her brain could automatically calculate these relationships, even without conscious thought. Using these familiar reference points would allow her to leverage skills she had already mastered. The first target of the day was a stationary paper silhouette at 300 yards. As Sarah settled into position, she became acutely aware of how different the experience was from normal shooting. Without the visual anchor of the target, she had to rely entirely on Torres's guidance and her own internal sense of direction and distance. "Target is directly ahead, 12 o'clock position," Torres said quietly into her earpiece. "Wind is coming from your left, about 5 miles per hour. Range is 300 yards exactly." Sarah made the mental calculations that had become second nature over years of training. At 300 yards with a 5-mile-per-hour crosswind, she would need to adjust her aim slightly to the right to compensate for bullet drift. But without being able to see the target, how could she know when her adjustment was correct? The answer, she discovered, lay in trusting her body's own precision instruments. Her breathing had settled into the calm, measured rhythm she had developed through thousands of practice sessions. Her hands held the rifle with the exact pressure and positioning that years of muscle memory had programmed into her nervous system. Most importantly, her internal sense of alignment, something she had never consciously analyzed, told her when the rifle was pointing in the right direction. She squeezed the trigger with the smooth, gradual pressure that was the hallmark of expert marksmanship. The rifle fired, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, Torres's voice came through her earpiece, tinged with unmistakable excitement. "Hit. Center mass, slightly to the right. That's a kill shot." A spontaneous cheer went up from the observers, and Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction unlike anything she had experienced in years of normal shooting. This wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about proving that human capabilities extended far beyond conventional assumptions. She had just done something that most people would consider impossible. But Dr. Park was already setting up the next challenge. "Now we're going to try a moving target," she announced. "It's a reactive target that will move laterally across your field of fire when triggered. You'll have about 5 seconds to acquire and engage." This was significantly more difficult. Not only would Sarah need to locate the target by sound, but she would also have to calculate its speed and direction, then predict where it would be when her bullet arrived. Even experienced snipers found moving targets challenging under normal circumstances. Torres positioned himself carefully to give Sarah the best possible information. The target will move from your left to your right, starting about 10 feet to your left of center, he explained. It's programmed to move at a walking pace, roughly 3 miles per hour. Sarah closed her eyes behind the blindfold and tried to visualize the scenario. A target moving from left to right at walking speed, at a distance of 300 yards. She would need to aim ahead of the target's current position, leading it by enough distance to account for the bullet's travel time. Initiating target movement, now, Dr. Park announced. Sarah immediately heard the mechanical sound of the target system activating, followed by a subtle noise that she assumed was the target itself moving along its track. But the sound was fainter than she had expected, and she found it difficult to pinpoint the exact location and speed of movement. Target is moving approximately 2 feet to your left of center and traveling right, Torres reported. Steady pace, maintaining speed. Sarah tried to follow the target's movement with her rifle, but without visual confirmation, she felt like she was chasing shadows. The mechanical sounds were inconsistent, sometimes masked by wind noise or other ambient sounds. She was operating entirely on faith that Torres's guidance was accurate and that her own spatial reasoning was correct. She pulled the trigger when her instincts told her the target should be in the right position. There was a moment of tense silence, followed by the distinctive sound of a bullet striking metal. Hit, Torres shouted. Not center mass, but definitely a hit. You caught the trailing edge of the target just as it was completing its movement. The watching officers exchanged glances of amazement, but Sarah barely heard their reactions. She was completely absorbed in analyzing what had just happened, trying to understand how she had successfully engaged a moving target without being able to see it. The experience was unlike anything from her previous training. Part calculation, part intuition, and part pure trust in skills she was still learning to access. Chief Kim approached her position with obvious excitement. Sarah, I don't know if you realize what you just did, but that was extraordinary. I've seen expert marksmen miss moving targets in broad daylight. What you just accomplished changes everything we thought we knew about sniper capabilities. But Dr. Park was already planning the next evolution. We're going to increase the complexity one more time today, she announced. Multiple targets, different distances, some stationary, and some moving. You'll engage them in sequence based on threat priority that your spotter will assign. This scenario was designed to simulate real combat conditions, where a sniper might face multiple threats requiring rapid target acquisition and engagement. Sarah would need to quickly shift between different aiming points, adjust for varying distances, and make split-second decisions about target priority. Torres laid out the scenario, 5 targets total. 2 stationary at 200 and 400 yards, directly ahead. 2 moving targets at 300 yards, 1 moving left to right, 1 moving right to left, and 1 pop-up target at 250 yards that will appear randomly. I'll call out threats as they become active. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she processed the complexity of what she was being asked to do. Even with full vision, this would be a challenging exercise. Attempting it while blindfolded seemed almost reckless. But she had come too far to back down now, and the success of her previous attempts had given her confidence that the seemingly impossible might actually be achievable. The exercise began with all targets activated simultaneously. Torres immediately began calling out priorities. Moving target, left to right at 300 yards, high threat. Engage immediately. Sarah swung her rifle to what she estimated was the correct position and began tracking the movement she could barely hear. The target's movement pattern was more erratic than the previous exercise, with speed changes that made prediction difficult. She fired when her instincts told her the lead was correct, and was rewarded with Torres confirming a hit. Target down. Switching to stationary target at 400 yards, 12 o'clock. She quickly adjusted her aim for the longer distance, using the muscle memory of hundreds of similar shots to guide her positioning. The target at 400 yards required different calculations for bullet drop and wind drift, adjustments that she had to make purely from memory without visual confirmation. The exercise continued for nearly 10 minutes, with Sarah engaging multiple targets in rapid succession. Some shots missed, but Her hit rate was far higher than anyone had expected. More importantly, she was demonstrating an ability to rapidly transition between different targets and distances while maintaining the mental composure necessary for precision shooting. By the time the exercise concluded, a small crowd had gathered to watch. Word had spread throughout the base about the unusual training taking place, and off-duty personnel had come to witness what many were calling either a remarkable breakthrough or an elaborate stunt. Commander Rodriguez approached Sarah as she unloaded her weapon. "Chun, I've been in this business for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. You're not just proving that this technique is possible, you're demonstrating that it could be tactically useful." But Sarah was already thinking beyond the immediate success of the exercise. She was beginning to understand that the blindfolded shooting was teaching her things about marksmanship that she had never learned through conventional training. Without the distraction of visual input, she was forced to focus on aspects of shooting that she had previously taken for granted. The connection between her breathing and her natural point of aim was more apparent when she couldn't rely on sight to correct her position. The subtle feedback from her rifle stock and trigger were more noticeable when they were her primary source of information about weapon alignment. Most importantly, she was developing a spatial awareness that seemed to extend beyond normal sensory limits. That evening, Sarah spent hours with Dr. Park discussing the neurological implications of what was happening. The research suggested that elite athletes often developed enhanced sensory capabilities in their area of expertise, but the speed with which Sarah was adapting to blindfolded shooting was unprecedented. "What you're demonstrating," Dr. Park explained, "is that expert-level motor skills can operate independently of the sensory systems we normally associate with them. Your brain has developed such sophisticated internal models of ballistics, wind effects, and spatial relationships that it can continue to function even when deprived of visual input." The third morning arrived with an ominous change in weather. Heavy clouds had rolled in overnight, bringing with them a steady drizzle that would make even normal shooting more challenging. But as Sarah stood before the elaborate urban warfare simulator that had been constructed for her final test, she realized that weather would be the least of her concerns. The facility had been transformed overnight into a complex maze of building facades, alleyways, and multi-level platforms designed to replicate the challenging environment of urban combat. Dr. Park had explained that this final exercise would test not just Sarah's ability to shoot while blindfolded, but her capacity to navigate complex tactical scenarios where split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Today's scenario is based on a real hostage rescue situation, Commander Rodriguez explained as they walked through a dry run of the course layout. "You'll be positioned in an elevated hide site, approximately 200 feet from a building where hostiles are holding civilians. Your mission is to eliminate specific threats while ensuring zero civilian casualties." Sarah felt the weight of this responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. Training exercises that involved civilian considerations were always the most stressful because they forced soldiers to operate under constraints that went far beyond simply hitting targets. The rules of engagement would require her to positively identify threats, distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and make split-second decisions about when deadly force was justified. "How will I identify the difference between hostiles and civilians if I can't see them?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's where your spotter team becomes critical," Torres replied. He had been joined by 2 additional spotters for this exercise, Sergeant Maria Santos and Corporal Jake Williams, both experienced snipers in their own right. "We'll be your eyes, but the final decision to engage will always be yours. You'll need to trust our identification, but you'll also need to trust your own instincts about when something doesn't feel right." Dr. Park had explained that this aspect of the exercise was designed to test the limits of human-machine integration. In future combat scenarios, snipers might need to operate with advanced technological assistance, thermal imaging, computer-aided target identification, or even artificial intelligence systems. But the human element would always remain crucial, particularly when life and death decisions had to be made under uncertain conditions. The exercise would unfold in 3 phases, each increasing in complexity and stress. The first phase would involve eliminating sentries while avoiding detection. The second phase would require engaging multiple targets during a simulated assault on the building. The final phase would involve precision shooting during the actual hostage rescue, with civilians and hostiles intermixed in close proximity. As Sarah took her position in the elevated hide site, she became aware of how much more complex this environment was than the previous day's exercises. Instead of the controlled conditions of the shooting range, she was now surrounded by urban noise, traffic sounds, construction equipment, aircraft overhead, and the general cacophony of city life. These ambient sounds would make it much more difficult to rely on audio cues for target location and identification. Torres positioned himself directly behind Sarah, with Santos and Williams flanking them at positions that would give them different perspectives on the target area. They had developed a more sophisticated communication system overnight, using code words and standardized phrases that would minimize confusion during the high-stress phases of the exercise. Phase 1 beginning now, Dr. Park announced through the radio system. 2 sentries are patrolling the building perimeter. They must be eliminated silently and simultaneously to avoid alerting other hostiles inside. Sarah immediately understood the tactical complexity of this scenario. Simultaneous elimination meant that both targets would need to be engaged within seconds of each other, requiring precise coordination between her shooting and the actions of other team members who would be handling the second target. Sentry 1 is moving along the east wall, approximately 180 yards from your position, Torres reported quietly. He's carrying an AK-47 and appears to be following a regular patrol pattern. Sentry 2 is stationary on the north side, 220 yards, but he has radio contact with someone inside the building. Sarah tracked her rifle toward the position Torres had indicated, trying to imagine the layout of the building and the patrol pattern of the first sentry. Without being able to see the target, she would need to time her shot perfectly to catch the sentry at a predictable point in his movement. Sentry 1 is approaching the corner of the building, Santos reported. He'll be stationary for approximately 10 seconds while he checks the alley entrance. That's your window. Sarah could hear the faint sound of footsteps on concrete, barely audible over the ambient city noise. She tracked the movement with her rifle, trying to predict exactly where the sentry would stop. When Torres whispered, "Target stationary, engage at will," Sarah took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The shot felt perfect. Smooth trigger pull, stable platform, controlled breathing. A moment later, Torres confirmed the hit. Target down, clean shot. Sentry 2 is still unaware. The second phase of the exercise began immediately, with multiple hostile targets appearing at windows and doorways throughout the building. Sarah would need to engage them quickly while avoiding hitting any of the mannequins that represented civilians scattered throughout the structure. Multiple targets emerging, Williams reported urgently. Window on the second floor, east side, armed hostile with RPG. Priority target. Sarah swung her rifle toward the indicated position, relying entirely on the spatial map she had built in her mind during the pre-exercise briefing. The target with the RPG would pose an immediate threat to friendly forces, making him the highest priority for elimination. Target acquired, she reported, though the words felt strange since she couldn't actually see what she was aiming at. Engaging. The shot rang out, followed immediately by the sound of breaking glass and Torres's confirmation. Hit confirmed, RPG neutralized. But there was no time to celebrate, as additional targets were already appearing throughout the building complex. For the next 15 minutes, Sarah engaged a rapid succession of threats while her spotters provided continuous updates on target locations, civilian positions, and changing tactical situations. The exercise pushed her abilities to their absolute limits. She was required to make split-second decisions about target priority while calculating complex ballistic solutions for shots at varying distances and angles. More challenging still, she had to maintain perfect discipline about when not to shoot, as civilian mannequins were frequently positioned close to legitimate targets. "Hold fire. Hold fire," Santos shouted during one particularly tense moment. Civilian directly behind the target. "Cannot engage." Sarah held her shot despite having a perfect solution on what Torres had identified as a high-priority target. The discipline required to stop an engagement when everything else said to shoot was perhaps the most difficult skill she had ever attempted to master. It required not just physical control, but complete trust in her spotter's judgment about situations she could not see for herself. The final phase of the exercise began with the simulated hostage rescue assault. Sarah's role was to provide precision fires during the actual breach, eliminating specific threats while the rescue team moved through the building. This required her to engage targets in extremely close proximity to friendlies, with the added complexity of hostages who might be moved or used as human shields. Breach team is moving to the 3rd floor, Rodriguez announced. Sarah, you have 3 potential targets in the main room. All are armed hostiles, but hostages are present. You are cleared to engage only when you have positive identification and clear shots. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Shooting in support of a dynamic entry was challenging enough under normal circumstances, but attempting it while blindfolded required a level of trust and coordination that pushed beyond anything she had ever attempted. First target visible in the eastern window, Torres reported. He's holding an AK-47 and appears to be preparing to fire on the breach team. No hostages in immediate vicinity. You are clear to engage. Sarah made the shot, relying entirely on Torres's guidance and her own intuitive sense of where the target should be. The confirmation came immediately. Target down, threat eliminated. But the situation was rapidly evolving, with hostiles and hostages moving throughout the building as the rescue team advanced. Sarah found herself engaging targets at distances as close as 150 feet, requiring precision that left no margin for error. Second target on the north wall, Williams reported. But there's a hostage approximately 2 feet to his left. This is a precision shot only. If you're not completely confident, hold fire. Sarah felt the weight of this decision like a physical pressure in her chest. The shot was technically within her capabilities, but the margin for error was essentially zero. Miss by even a few inches, and she could hit an innocent person. But if she didn't take the shot, the hostile might kill members of the rescue team. She steadied her breathing and tried to feel the absolute center of her weapon's alignment. Everything had to be perfect: her position, her breathing, her trigger control, and, most importantly, her trust in the guidance she was receiving from her spotters. I have the shot, she whispered, and squeezed the trigger with the smoothest motion she could manage. Hit confirmed, Torres said, his voice tight with relief. Hostile down, hostage unharmed. The exercise concluded with Sarah successfully eliminating 7 hostile targets while avoiding any civilian casualties. As she removed the blindfold and looked at the complex urban environment she had been operating in, she felt overwhelmed by what she had just accomplished. The building complex was far more intricate than she had imagined, with multiple levels, intersecting fields of fire, and sight lines that would have challenged even an experienced sniper under normal circumstances. Commander Rodriguez approached her with an expression of amazement and respect. Chun, what you just demonstrated isn't just impressive, it's revolutionary. You've proven that human capabilities can extend far beyond what we thought was possible, even under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Dr. Park was equally enthusiastic, but her excitement was tempered by scientific caution. The implications of this are enormous, she said as they reviewed the exercise data. But we need to understand exactly what enabled you to perform at this level. Was it purely enhanced sensory processing, or were there other factors involved? As Sarah reflected on the 3-day experience, she began to understand that her success hadn't been due to any single factor, but rather to a combination of elements that had worked together in unexpected ways. Her years of training had provided the technical foundation, but the blindfolded exercises had forced her to develop new ways of processing and integrating information. More importantly, she had learned to trust her spotters in a way that went beyond normal military communication. The relationship had evolved into something approaching telepathy, where subtle changes in tone or pacing conveyed information that went far beyond the literal content of their words. The weeks following the blindfolded shooting experiment brought changes that Sarah could never have anticipated. What had begun as a simple training exercise had somehow transformed into something much larger, a catalyst for examining fundamental assumptions about human capability and military training methods. Dr. Park had returned to Johns Hopkins to analyze the data, but not before informing Sarah that preliminary results were unlike anything in the scientific literature. The speed of her adaptation, the precision she had achieved, and, most importantly, the repeatability of her performance suggested that blindfolded shooting wasn't just a novelty. It was a teachable skill that could potentially revolutionize how snipers were trained. Commander Rodriguez had been equally impressed with the practical implications. "Chun, I've been getting calls from Pentagon brass, training command, and research facilities across the country," he told her during their weekly evaluation meeting. "Everyone wants to know how we can replicate what you accomplished." But Sarah was discovering that success brought complications she hadn't considered. The story of her blindfolded shooting had spread through military channels with remarkable speed, growing and changing with each retelling. Some versions made her sound like a supernatural phenomenon, while others suggested that the entire exercise had been an elaborate publicity stunt. Neither characterization felt accurate to her experience. The truth was both more mundane and more significant than the rumors suggested. Sarah had simply learned to trust capabilities that every experienced sniper possessed, but rarely developed to their full potential. The blindfold had forced her to access skills that were normally overshadowed by reliance on visual input, but those skills had been there all along, waiting to be recognized and refined. Torres had become something of a celebrity himself, as military training specialists sought to understand his role in Sarah's success. It wasn't just about giving her directions, he explained during one of several debriefing sessions. It was about developing a communication system that could convey spatial information with mathematical precision. We had to create a shared language that could operate under extreme stress. The spotting techniques that Torres, Santos, and Williams had developed were already being incorporated into sniper training programs at other facilities. Their method of using time delays, sound references, and spatial relationships rather than visual landmarks had applications that extended far beyond blindfolded shooting. It was proving useful in low-visibility conditions, night operations, and situations where traditional spotting methods were compromised. But the most significant impact was on Sarah herself. The experiment had fundamentally changed how she approached every aspect of her professional responsibilities. Having learned to trust her non-visual senses completely, she found that her performance in normal shooting situations had actually improved. She was noticing wind patterns earlier, detecting target movement more quickly, and making ballistic calculations with greater precision than ever before. Chief Kim had observed these improvements during regular training exercises and had asked Sarah to work with other snipers in the unit to share what she had learned. These informal training sessions had evolved into structured workshops where team members explored their own sensory capabilities under various limiting conditions. "It's not about shooting blind," Sarah explained to a group of junior snipers during one of these sessions. "It's about understanding all the information your senses are providing, not just what your eyes are telling you. When you can integrate all of that information simultaneously, your overall performance improves dramatically." The workshops had become popular throughout the training command, with snipers traveling from other units to participate. Sarah found herself teaching techniques she was still learning herself, discovering that the process of instruction was helping her understand the neurological basis of what she had experienced. Dr. Park had stayed in contact throughout this period, sharing preliminary research findings and asking Sarah to participate in follow-up studies. The neuroscience data was revealing patterns that had implications far beyond military training. Brain imaging conducted during the blindfolded shooting had shown unusual activity in regions normally associated with spatial processing, suggesting that expert motor skills could recruit neural networks not typically involved in those functions. "What you've demonstrated," Dr. Park explained during one of their video conferences, "is that expertise can create new pathways between different brain systems. The blindfolded shooting forced your visual cortex to work differently, allowing other sensory systems to become dominant in ways that aren't normally possible." This research was attracting attention from civilian applications as well. Rehabilitation specialists working with visually impaired patients were interested in the training methods. Athletic coaches wanted to understand how sensory limitation might enhance performance in other sports. Even musicians were exploring how the techniques might improve their spatial awareness and timing precision. But Sarah was also becoming aware of a more troubling aspect of her newfound fame. Military and civilian researchers were proposing increasingly elaborate experiments, some of which seemed to miss the point of what had made the original exercise successful. There were suggestions for shooting in complete darkness, engaging targets while wearing noise-dampening headphones, and even attempting precision fire while under the influence of various pharmaceutical agents that might alter sensory processing. "They're turning it into a circus," Sarah confided to Torres during one of their regular training sessions. It was never about creating some kind of superhuman sniper. It was about understanding and developing capabilities that already exist. Torres nodded sympathetically. He had been receiving similar requests to participate in increasingly exotic training scenarios. And, like Sarah, he was concerned that the focus was shifting away from practical applications toward pure spectacle. Commander Rodriguez had been fielding these requests and trying to maintain focus on legitimate research objectives. "The problem is that everyone wants to find the magic formula," he explained. "They think if we can just identify the right combination of conditions and training methods, we can mass-produce snipers with supernatural abilities." Sarah knew this was missing the point entirely. Her success hadn't been due to any revolutionary training method or previously unknown technique. It had been the result of years of conventional training, combined with the right mental approach and excellent communication with her spotters. The blindfold had simply forced her to access capabilities that extensive training had already developed. The real lesson, she was beginning to understand, was about the nature of expertise itself. True mastery in any field created capabilities that extended beyond normal limitations, but those capabilities were built through years of dedicated practice and gradual refinement. There were no shortcuts to this kind of development, and attempts to rush the process usually resulted in superficial imitation rather than genuine skill. This realization was reinforced during a visit from Colonel Patricia Hayes, a senior officer from the Army's marksmanship unit who had come to observe Sarah's training methods firsthand. Colonel Hayes had decades of experience in competitive and military shooting, and her perspective provided valuable context for what Sarah had accomplished. "I've seen a lot of exceptional shooters over the years," Colonel Hayes said after watching Sarah demonstrate some of the blindfolded techniques. "What you've developed isn't supernatural. It's the logical extension of expert-level skills. The remarkable thing is that you've found a way to access and develop those capabilities intentionally." Colonel Hayes explained that elite competitive shooters often reported similar experiences, moments when their performance transcended normal limitations, when they seemed to know where targets were without consciously seeing them, when their shots felt guided by intuition rather than calculation. But these experiences were typically sporadic and unpredictable. "What your training has done," she continued, "is create a systematic way to access that level of performance deliberately. That's what makes this significant for military applications." This validation from such an experienced professional helped Sarah understand the true value of what she had accomplished. It wasn't about creating superhuman abilities, but about finding reliable methods for accessing the full potential of human capabilities that extensive training had developed. As word of the experiment continued to spread, Sarah found herself invited to speak at military conferences, academic symposiums, and professional training events. These speaking engagements gave her opportunities to share the real lessons of the experience while correcting some of the more sensationalized accounts that had begun circulating. At a conference on human performance optimization at the Naval War College, Sarah had the opportunity to present her findings to an audience that included military leaders, research scientists, and training specialists from various branches of service. Her presentation focused on the practical applications of enhanced sensory training rather than the spectacular aspects of blindfolded shooting. "The goal isn't to create soldiers who can fight without sight," she explained to the audience. "The goal is to develop soldiers who can access the full range of their sensory capabilities when their primary senses are compromised or when environmental conditions limit normal perception." This message resonated with military leaders who understood that modern combat often took place in conditions where visibility was limited, in smoke, dust, darkness, or adverse weather. Soldiers who could maintain effectiveness when their normal sensory inputs were degraded would have significant tactical advantages. The presentation also addressed the broader implications for training methodology. Traditional military training focused heavily on developing specific skills through repetition and gradual progression. But Sarah's experience suggested that deliberately limiting sensory input could accelerate the development of alternative capabilities that might otherwise remain dormant. 6 months after the blindfolded shooting experiment, Sarah found herself deployed to a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, where her unit was providing support for a multinational peacekeeping operation. The deployment had begun routinely, with her team conducting standard reconnaissance and overwatch missions in a region that had been relatively stable for several years. But political tensions had been escalating, and intelligence reports suggested that hostile forces were planning operations that could destabilize the entire area. Sarah's sniper team had been positioned in a strategic observation post overlooking a critical transportation corridor that coalition forces needed to keep secure. The observation post was located in an abandoned industrial building that provided excellent fields of fire and concealment, but it also presented certain vulnerabilities. The building's electrical system had been damaged by previous conflicts, leaving the team dependent on battery-powered equipment for communications and night vision. More concerning, intelligence indicated that hostile forces were using advanced electronic warfare capabilities that could potentially disable or compromise coalition equipment. Torres was still serving as Sarah's primary spotter, and their partnership had only grown stronger since the experimental training. The months of working together under various challenging conditions had refined their communication to the point where they could convey complex information with minimal verbal exchange. This capability would prove more valuable than either of them realized. On the third night of their current mission, Sarah was awakened by Torres shaking her gently, but urgently. "We've got a problem," he whispered. "Electronic countermeasures have knocked out all our night vision and communications equipment. The entire sector has gone dark." Sarah immediately understood the implications. Without night vision or radio communications, her team was effectively blind and deaf to the tactical situation developing around them. They had backup communications equipment, but it would take time to establish contact with headquarters, and their night vision devices would be inoperable until the electronic interference ceased. "What's our current situation?" Sarah asked as she gathered her equipment in the darkness. "Unknown," Torres replied. "The last intelligence update indicated possible hostile movement in our sector, but we lost communications before getting details. We know friendly forces are operating in the area, but we don't know their exact positions or current status." This was precisely the kind of situation that the blindfolded shooting training had been designed to address. Sarah and her team would need to maintain their defensive capability without the technological aids they normally relied upon. More challenging still, they would need to do so while ensuring that they didn't accidentally engage friendly forces operating in the same area. Chief Kim, who was serving as the team leader for this deployment, gathered the team together to assess their options. "We have two choices," he said quietly. "We can abandon this position and try to reach friendly lines, or we can remain here and maintain overwatch of the transportation corridor." Both options carried significant risks. Moving through hostile territory without communications or night vision would expose the team to numerous threats they couldn't detect or avoid. But remaining in position meant defending their location with severely limited situational awareness. "How long until sunrise?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Approximately 4 hours," Kim replied. "Too long to wait if hostile forces are moving against coalition positions tonight." Sarah found herself thinking about the experimental training and the capabilities she had developed through blindfolded shooting. Those techniques had been designed for controlled conditions with known targets and friendly spotters providing guidance. But the principles might still apply to the current situation. Enhanced reliance on non-visual senses, improved spatial awareness, and the ability to make precise shots based on sound and spatial reasoning. "I think we should stay," Sarah said after considering the alternatives. "If hostile forces are using this corridor for movement, our position gives us the best chance of detecting and interdicting them. And if friendly forces need support, we're better positioned to provide it from here than we would be moving through unknown territory." Kim nodded thoughtfully. Sarah's assessment aligned with his own tactical judgment, but He was also aware that defending their position would require capabilities that went beyond normal training. "Can you maintain effectiveness without night vision?" he asked directly. "I think so," Sarah replied, though she felt less confident than her words suggested. "The blindfolded training taught me to use other senses for target detection and engagement. The techniques should work in real darkness, though the stress level will be different." Torres was nodding in agreement. "The communication systems we developed should work even better in actual darkness," he said. "We know the terrain, we have predetermined reference points, and we've practiced these techniques under high-stress conditions." But Corporal Williams, the team's newest member, raised a concern that all of them were thinking about. "What about target identification? In training, we knew everyone on the range was either a target or a friendly spotter. Out here, we could have friendlies, hostiles, and civilians all moving through our area of operations." This was the most challenging aspect of their current situation. Rules of engagement required positive identification of threats before deadly force could be employed, but positive identification was virtually impossible without visual confirmation. Sarah would need to rely entirely on her spotter's judgment about whether detected movement represented a legitimate threat. The team spent the next hour establishing their defensive plan. They identified the most likely approach routes for hostile forces, established communication protocols that would work in complete darkness, and rehearsed procedures for engaging targets while minimizing the risk of friendly fire incidents. Sarah positioned herself at the window that provided the best field of fire over the main transportation corridor. Torres took position directly behind her, with Williams and Kim covering different approaches to their building. They established a system of hand signals and whispered communications that would allow them to share information without compromising their position. The first indication of movement came just after 2 a.m., when Torres detected the sound of vehicles moving without lights along the main road. The electronic warfare situation was still in effect, so the team couldn't communicate with headquarters to verify whether the vehicles represented friendly or hostile forces. "Multiple vehicles, moving slowly without lights," Torres whispered. "Approximately 800 yards south, moving north along the main road." Sarah oriented her rifle toward the reported position, though she could see nothing in the complete darkness. She found herself relying on the same techniques she had developed during the blindfolded training, using her hearing to detect direction and distance, using her spatial awareness to track movement patterns, and trusting her spotters to provide accurate information about what they could detect. "Vehicle spacing suggests military convoy," Torres continued, "but no way to determine if friendly or hostile based on current information." This was the moment Sarah had hoped would never come, having to make life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information while operating beyond normal sensory limitations. The convoy could represent friendly forces conducting a legitimate operation, or it could be hostile forces moving to attack coalition positions. Without radio communications, there was no way to verify identity or intentions. "Hold fire until we have positive identification of hostile intent," Kim whispered through the tactical radio system. "Observe and report only." For the next 20 minutes, the team tracked the convoy's movement through their sector. The vehicles were clearly trying to avoid detection, moving slowly and stopping frequently to listen for signs of coalition presence. But this behavior alone wasn't sufficient to identify them as hostile. Friendly special operations forces might use similar tactics in contested areas. The situation clarified suddenly when Torres detected the distinctive sound of weapons being prepared for firing. "Weapons preparation sounds from the lead vehicle," he reported urgently. "Multiple personnel dismounting. Movement toward coalition checkpoint approximately 400 yards northeast of our position." Now Sarah had the target identification she needed. The vehicles were clearly moving to attack a known coalition position, and rules of engagement authorized defensive fires to protect friendly forces. But engaging targets in complete darkness, at significant range, with friendly forces in the general area, would require precision that tested the absolute limits of her capabilities. "Multiple personnel moving toward coalition positions," Torres continued. "Approximately 6 individuals, spread formation, all appear to be carrying weapons. Range for 150 yards, bearing northeast from our position." Sarah made the mental calculations that had become automatic through years of training. Range 450 yards, unknown wind conditions, targets moving in darkness toward friendly positions. She would need to rely entirely on Torres's guidance for target location and movement, but the final decision to engage would be hers alone. First target approximately 20 yards ahead of the group, Torres whispered. He appears to be carrying a heavy weapon, possibly RPG. Priority target. Sarah aimed toward the position Torres had indicated, using the same techniques she had learned during blindfolded training. She couldn't see the target, but she could visualize the terrain, estimate the range and wind effects, and trust her muscle memory to guide proper rifle alignment. The shot broke the silence of the night like thunder. A moment later, Torres confirmed the hit, target down. Hostile forces are reacting, moving toward cover. What followed was a 15-minute engagement that tested every skill Sarah had developed through the experimental training. Working entirely in darkness, she engaged multiple targets at ranges from 200 to 600 yards, relying on Torres's spotting and her own enhanced sensory capabilities to maintain precision fire. The hostile force, apparently surprised by accurate fire from an unexpected direction, attempted to withdraw toward their vehicles. But Sarah's position gave her control over their primary escape route, and her ability to maintain effective fire in complete darkness prevented them from reaching their transportation. By the time sunrise restored visual contact, 6 hostile personnel had been eliminated, and their planned attack on coalition positions had been completely disrupted. More importantly, no friendly forces had been injured, and no civilians had been endangered by the engagement. As communications were gradually restored throughout the morning, Sarah learned that her team's actions had prevented what intelligence analysts later determined would have been a significant attack on coalition forces. The hostile force had been equipped with heavy weapons and explosives capable of causing substantial casualties if their assault had been successful. Commander Rodriguez, who had flown in to debrief the engagement, was amazed by what Sarah's team had accomplished. "Chun, what you did last night goes beyond anything I've ever seen in 25 years of military service. You successfully engaged multiple targets in complete darkness at significant range while ensuring 0 friendly casualties. That's not just exceptional shooting. That's a complete redefinition of what's possible." But Sarah knew that the success hadn't been due to any supernatural ability or revolutionary technique. It had been the result of extensive training, exceptional teamwork, and the confidence to trust capabilities that conventional training rarely developed. The blindfolded shooting experiment had provided the foundation, but the real test had been the willingness to apply those skills when lives depended on the outcome. Dr. Park, who interviewed Sarah extensively about the engagement, was particularly interested in the decision-making process under such extreme conditions. "What you demonstrated," she explained, "is that expert-level skills can operate reliably even when normal sensory inputs are completely compromised. But, more importantly, you showed that enhanced sensory training can provide tactical advantages even when normal vision is available." The incident had profound implications for military training and doctrine. It demonstrated that soldiers could maintain effectiveness even when their technological advantages were neutralized by enemy countermeasures. It showed that human capabilities, when properly developed, could provide redundancy for electronic systems that might fail or be compromised. But, for Sarah, the most important lesson was about the nature of trust and teamwork under extreme stress. Her success had depended not just on her own skills, but on complete confidence in Torres's abilities and judgment. The partnership they had developed through months of training and deployment had enabled them to function effectively as a single unit, even when operating beyond normal human limitations. As her deployment continued, Sarah found that the engagement had changed how her entire unit approached their missions. They began incorporating enhanced sensory training into their routine preparation, developing backup procedures for situations where their normal equipment might be compromised, and building the kind of trust-based partnerships that had enabled her success in darkness. The story of the engagement spread throughout military circles, but not as a tale of supernatural marksmanship. Instead, it became a case study in the importance of developing human capabilities that could complement and, when necessary, replace technological systems. It demonstrated that the most advanced equipment was only as effective as the soldiers using it, and that human potential could extend far beyond conventional limitations when properly challenged and developed. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that night as the moment when she truly understood what the blindfolded shooting experiment had been about. It hadn't been about learning to shoot without sight. It had been about learning to trust capabilities she had always possessed but had never fully accessed. And in that trust, she had found a level of professional confidence and competence that would guide her through the rest of her military career and beyond. The darkness that had seemed like such a disadvantage had actually revealed strengths she never knew existed. And, in that revelation, she had discovered that the greatest limitations were often self-imposed, and that human potential was far more expansive than anyone had dared to imagine. Following the conference, Sarah was approached by representatives from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, who were interested in funding expanded research into sensory enhancement training. But she was also contacted by veterans organizations that saw potential applications for soldiers who had suffered sensory injuries in combat. This dual interest, in enhancing capabilities for active duty personnel and in rehabilitation for injured veterans, seemed to capture the true significance of what the experiment had revealed. Human beings possessed remarkable capacities for adaptation and compensation, but accessing those capacities often required the right kind of challenge and support. As Sarah returned to Coronado after the conference, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. What had begun as a simple volunteer assignment had evolved into something that was affecting her career, her understanding of her own capabilities, and her perspective on human potential in general. But, perhaps most importantly, the experience had given her a deeper appreciation for the collaborative nature of elite performance. Her success in blindfolded shooting hadn't been an individual achievement. It had been the result of exceptional teamwork with Torres, Santos, and Williams, combined with the scientific expertise of Dr. Park and the institutional support of Commander Rodriguez. This understanding would prove crucial as she faced the final and most challenging test of everything she had learned, a real-world application of blindfolded shooting techniques that would test not just her skills, but her judgment about when those skills should be employed in actual combat conditions. But, perhaps most significantly, Sarah had discovered that removing her sight had actually enhanced her overall situational awareness. Without the overwhelming input of visual information, she had been able to focus more completely on the subtle cues that indicated target location, movement patterns, and tactical opportunities. As the research team began packing up their equipment, Sarah realized that this experience had changed her understanding of what it meant to be an expert marksman. She had always thought of precision shooting as primarily a physical skill, but the blindfolded exercises had revealed it to be something much more complex, an integration of physical technique, mental processing, and intuitive understanding that operated at levels below conscious awareness. The implications extended far beyond military applications. If human beings could develop such sophisticated capabilities when forced to operate beyond normal sensory limits, what other hidden potentials might be waiting to be discovered? And how might this understanding change the way society approached everything from athletic training to medical rehabilitation? But those were questions for researchers and theorists to explore. For Sarah, the immediate impact was more personal and immediate. She had proven to herself and others that the boundaries of human capability were far more flexible than anyone had imagined. And in that proof, she had found a new level of confidence in her abilities that would stay with her for the rest of her career. As she prepared to leave the training facility, Sarah took one last look at the urban environment where she had accomplished something that most people would consider impossible. Tomorrow, she would return to normal training and operations, but she would carry with her the knowledge that human potential could extend far beyond conventional limitations when properly challenged and developed. The experiment was over, but its implications were just beginning to be understood. This scientific explanation resonated with Sarah's own experience. She wasn't really shooting blind. She was shooting with a different kind of sight, one based on years of accumulated knowledge and refined intuition. The blindfold hadn't taken away her ability to see the target. It had forced her to see it in a completely different way. As she prepared for the final day of the experiment, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation unlike anything she had experienced since her first combat deployment. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test, engaging targets in a simulated urban environment while blindfolded, with multiple threat scenarios and the added complexity of civilian considerations. She had already proven that blindfolded shooting was possible. Now she had to prove that it could be practical and reliable under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The stakes had risen beyond personal achievement. She was now carrying the weight of scientific validation and the potential to change how military training approached the development of human capabilities. But more than that, Sarah was beginning to understand that this exercise was teaching her something fundamental about the nature of expertise itself. True mastery, she was discovering, meant developing capabilities that transcended normal limitations. And tomorrow, she would have the chance to demonstrate just how far those capabilities could extend. Beauty into sensory compensation and neuroplasticity. Recent advances in neuroscience had shown that the human brain was far more adaptable than previously thought, capable of rewiring itself to compensate for lost or impaired senses. The military applications were obvious, but the research also had potential benefits for civilian populations, particularly veterans who had suffered sensory injuries in combat. As Sarah listened to the scientific explanation, she felt a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her own personal challenge anymore. It was about contributing to research that could help fellow soldiers and veterans. The weight of that responsibility was both intimidating and motivating. The first day of training began with basic weapon handling while blindfolded. Sarah had to learn to load, aim, and fire her rifle using only touch and sound cues. It was frustrating at first, like learning to write with her non-dominant hand, but gradually she began to develop a rhythm. The rifle that had felt like an extension of her body suddenly felt foreign and clumsy, but with each repetition, familiarity slowly returned. Torres, who had volunteered to be her primary spotter, worked with her on developing a communication system. Traditional spotting involved visual references, target at 2 o'clock, 300 yards behind the large boulder. For this exercise, they had to create a new vocabulary based on sound cues and relative directions. By the end of the first day, Sarah had successfully hit paper targets at 100 yards while blindfolded, though her accuracy was far below her usual standards. More importantly, she was beginning to understand how her other senses could provide information she had never consciously noticed before. The sound of the wind shifting direction, the way her heartbeat affected the steady rhythm of her breathing, the subtle feedback through the rifle stock that indicated proper alignment. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and uncertainty about what the next 2 days would bring. She had proven to herself that shooting while blindfolded was at least theoretically possible, but the real tests were yet to come. The targets would be farther away, the conditions more challenging, and the stakes higher. But for the first time since accepting the challenge, Sarah felt genuinely optimistic about her chances. She was beginning to understand that this exercise wasn't about fighting against her blindness. It was about learning to trust capabilities she had always possessed but had never fully explored. And in that realization, she found the confidence she would need for the trials ahead. You never knew existed.